So, good afternoon. I'm Tatiana Bazzichelli, curator of Transmediale Festival, and I'm really happy to announce the start of a new panel as part of the Ashes to Ashes stream. The title of this panel is Circumventing the Panopticon, Whistleblowing, Cypherpunk and Journalism in the Network's Fifth Estate. And I would like to say that this event is directly connected with the keynotes that we had on Thursday night with Jake Appelbaum, Trevor Paglin, and Laura Poitras. In this specific event, we are bringing together into a dialogue whistleblowers and also activists, because I will introduce one of them that is also our moderator, and the journalists to discuss on the strategies of awareness and modality to expose hidden bugs in the socio-political systems. So I already anticipate that I was going to introduce Diani Barreto, that is also the moderator of this panel, and she's an independent researcher on whistleblowers and activism, and she's also the spokesperson for the Free Chelsea Manning Netz in Berlin and public relations officer for the Wow Holland Stiftung. And we have been already the pleasure to collaborate with Diani already many times here at Transmediale. Last year, she was actually taking the identity of the CEO, Octavia, of the Octo Telecomunisten project. And we have been also starting to work during the resource program in the year. And I think I really feel to thank Diani, because immediately during the party of Transmediale last year, she came to me and she told me, Tatiana, we have to do something. And she was really determined in organizing an event about the whistleblowers and Bloody Manning. So we did it in May, also inviting several speakers, among Brigitta Jonstottir, and we started to collaborate together. And we have been working together almost 1 year, researching on these topics, and I feel that I really deeply have to thank her, because it's also thanks to her enthusiasm, passion, and also courage that we have been able to organize an event like this. And I hope that we will also do in the future new activities together. And really thanks a lot, Diani, for being the person you are. And now I pass the word to you, and I welcome everybody here.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Tatiana, for that very heartwarming introduction. Thank you, Transmediale, Tatiana Bazzichelli, and Christopher Gansing for also having allowed me to research these subjects before they were even hot topics in the public domain. I'm really, really grateful for that and for your unending support. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today on this last edition of Transmediale, the Afterglow, and to our panel, Circumventing the Panopticon, with our amazing panel list guests here today, William Binney, Annie Michon, and Alexa O'Brien. It's really extraordinary to have them all here today. So I'll begin with a little expose, a little backstory for our audience to prepare for this panel. And then I'll go on to Bill Binney, and then Alexa O'Brien, and then Annie Michon. I'll ask a couple of questions. I actually have 2 questions from 2 cypherpunks that couldn't be here today. And then we'll open up the questions to the audience. Thank you. The recent disclosures made by Edward J. Snowden encompass some of the most severe threats to human rights and democracy today. Morally and philosophically speaking, the question arises, what is more important, to obey the law without exception, or to stop war crime, torture, occupation, and endless suffering? Chelsea Manning actually asked those very questions, and she anticipated Edward Snowden with her monumental act of civil disobedience. Hers was the largest breach in national security at the time. Her intention was to spark worldwide discussion, debates, and reform. We are actually having this debate right now. Thank you, Chelsea. She said, we elected to hide behind the veil of national security and classified information in order to avoid any public accountability. I think Chelsea was definitely calling into question the fundamental righteousness of the American system of justice. Chelsea's revelations helped end a state of impunity and the war in Iraq by leaking what became known as the Iraq war logs and the collateral murder video that was published on the WikiLeaks website. These were conducive to the Iraqi government's refusal to grant ongoing immunity to US troops, which ended the US occupation in 2011. The aberration known as the global war on terror was the US response to 9/11. America became known as a nation that uses torture at home and abroad and tortures its own, like Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, and allows for sites from hell without habeas corpus such as Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, and other legal black holes. We've become increasingly aware how the US government has instituted injustice, and normalized injustice in the war on terror. And now we see how the secret dragnet surveillance programs are serving to incriminate individuals deemed undesirable by the US administration. Now we have chilling evidence that anti-terrorism laws are being routinely used by federal government agencies and other governments to criminalize nonviolent democratic dissent and falsely link dissidents and journalists to international terrorist organizations. The United States government is using the pretext of combating terrorism to reverse all the values laid out originally in the Constitution. Our guest panelist, William Binney, in mid-December last year, told the Washington's blog, and I quote, "The US has already become a police state." So how are we supposed to deal with this information when the law enforcement agencies such as the Department of Justice, the FBI, the DEA, are using this information in a planned, programmed perjury policy, and they use this information, launder this information, and then incriminate people for petty offenses like tax and sex offenses or whatever else, whatever they can find. But it's been all acquired without a warrant, basically. And they're also forwarding this information to foreign governments. And these foreign governments also whitewashing it, using it for their means and ends. And it's a back and forth, and it's absolutely all acquired without a warrant. Is that not scary enough? How are we to react to these revelations? I mean, there comes a point in time when you say, okay, the totalitarian or the turnkey totalitarian state is upon us, and it's time to rein them in or do something and take it back. So this brings us to the point that this global event is affecting all of us and will affect us and all of us in the future generations. This is not just about the rights of American citizens or Mrs. Merkel's phone. We are in a state of emergency, and we're not being told. Were it not for the whistleblowers, we would not know about it. Thank you for their service. I think what we're doing here, or my original intention was to have a panel in order to ask them how can we regain agency again, because I think most citizens are lost with the amount of information, and it's absolutely just disheartening what is upon us right now. And I think perhaps you might have some oversight, and we'd be glad to hear your, when you tell us about your talk. Germany is also not excluded from these aberrations. They're actually gathering data for the US, and this data is being used to orchestrate drone strikes on the African continent, which is actually a very illegal activity and goes against their constitutional protections as well. So I think we have the great afterglow of the rule of law, where impunity rules and the truth tellers are the terrorists. Yes, I guess one could assert that 2013 has propelled us into the afterglow of journalism too. On Saturday, July 20th, 2013, we witnessed what The Guardian's editor Alan Rusbridger described as the most surreal event he had ever witnessed in British journalism, where two technicians from the British GCHQ oversaw how the journalists took the drills to the internal components of The Guardian's hard drives containing the Snowden docs and rendered them useless by destructing the hardware to bits, no pun intended. The leaks continued, and they will continue. I would argue that there were several extremely bizarre events in British journalism last year. I can't wait for Annie to tell us more about that. Such as when the British security service MI5 was behind Glenn Greenwald's partner, the arrest at Heathrow, last August. Miranda was detained under the Schedule 7 of the UK's Terrorism Act of 2000, despite having no connection to terrorism. This is a very unsettling development, and now journalists are now accomplices to terror or will be labeled flatly as terrorists. He was simply carrying heavily encrypted Snowden material at the time, which is not a crime. It was reported that the MI5 tried to conceal its role in the affair, wink at Annie, by telling the police at Heathrow, please do not make any reference to espionage activity. It is vital that Miranda is not aware of the reason for this port stop. Subsequently, we learned that the recent attacks on journalism in the UK were personally sanctioned by Cameron himself. It was argued many times last year that if the free press is to function, it means communicating with a journalist, the communication has to be protected. We learned that the NSA has made private electronic communication essentially impossible for all of us, and that means heads of state, OPEC leaders, bank heads, activists, politicians, you name it. What mechanisms do we have in place for such a dystopic scenario, where crimes against humanity are codified and normalized, and where the mainstream media defends the reasons of the state and turns a blind eye to glaring injustice and puts us all at risk? Are we now all potentially accomplices to terrorism? Where is our consent in all of this? We are experiencing a crackdown, or we experienced in 2013, a great year of crackdown on hacktivists and whistleblowers in an effort aimed at restricting, quashing, detaining, and condemning all methods of civil disobedience and disclosure in the information age. In June 2013, we learned about the metadata program, which compels at least Verizon, and perhaps other telcos as well, to routinely hand over all the phone records to the NSA. That disclosure was the debut leak of Edward Snowden. It brought home the notion of the hitherto unimaginable proportions of the predations of the state in regard to suspicionless surveillance on citizens in the US, and later we learned everywhere. It revealed how the internet, the hardware, the software, the backbone, the certificates, the crypto, the devices, the apps, the games, and the social networks, and the cloud have all been compromised. We learned the real meaning of big data, and I'm kind of quoting Jesselyn Radek here. It refers how the NSA gorges itself for the data of the dragnet overflow. And it is not stopping terror. In fact, it engenders more hate and terror. We have learned that the US is not a very good steward of the internet, and nor is it a trustworthy partner in statecraft. We learned how government agencies and their allies engage in surveillance, but their goal is absolute non-attribution. It was undoubtedly the year of the whistleblowers. Beginning with the scenario of John Kiriakou, who blew the whistle on CIA torture programs, we had the mistrial known as the court-martial of Chelsea Manning. It tried and convicted Manning for violating the Espionage Act and sentenced her to 35 years in prison for blowing the whistle. During these proceedings, we learned how the federal government views Julian Assange and Manning as criminals. We learned how the prosecutors in Manning's trial repeatedly tried to contend that Assange actively encouraged Manning's crimes, but he failed. We witnessed the ongoing vicious campaigns from journalists and elites that infringed upon his presumption of innocence, despite the fact that Assange has never been charged. We know as a fact that a grand jury in Alexandria, Virginia, has been impaneled to explore charges against him and the WikiLeaks organization, and that means volunteers such as Jacob Appelbaum and others. And yet WikiLeaks inspired and made the Manning leaks possible and available to the public. These leaks in turn inspired Snowden. And WikiLeaks also made these leaks intrinsically possible by guaranteeing for his safety. And yet Edward Snowden's revelations, which President Obama calls unauthorized disclosures, have revealed that there continues to be an utter lack of accountability and control in the intelligence apparati. Well, who broke the law, I ask, and who subverted the Constitution? In the meantime, we're in the midst of a worldwide Promethean effort by activists, pundits, journalists, artists, technologists, and hackers, and virtuous leakers that are all trying to shed light and challenge the executive coup that took place after 9/11, and to bring evidence to the public on the dark dealings of our governments. This panel sets out to review what we've learned about the NSA spying practices and the ramifications of those revelations, and questioning the fourth estate, which is traditionally the media, whether it is still capable as an agency for greater accountability in government and in politics. Now we have the big chill. Protecting digital communications is turning into the press freedom battle of the 21st century. The New York Times public editor Margaret Sullivan earlier this year said, "It's turning out to be the administration of unprecedented secrecy and unprecedented attacks on the free press." That's quite ironic because President Obama said that default should be disclosure. So Daniel Ellsberg recently pointed out in his brilliant marathon, 7-hour-long marathon, Ask Me Anything, he addressed what the common response of the normal people in the face of mass surveillance, when they all say, well, I don't have anything to hide, why should I be afraid? Well, here we go. So people who have nothing to hide should ask themselves if it is equally true of their spouses or their children or neighbors who could possibly be turned into informants by the threat of their private lives being revealed. Do they really believe that real democracy is viable when one branch of government, the executive, knows or can know every detail of every private communication or credit card transaction or movement, or every journalist, or every source to every journalist, or every member of Congress and their staffs, every judge, at every level, all the way up to the Supreme Court? Do they really think that every one of these people has nothing to hide? Nothing that could be used against them to blackmail them, to manipulate them, or to neutralize dissent to the executive policies or influence their voting behavior? Some stuff to think about there. When I'm referring to the Fifth Estate, the network Fifth Estate, I'm also making reference to Yochai Benkler's Fourth Estate in the Manning trial, which I'm sure you will also perhaps tell us about, or maybe not. The Fifth Estate has been used to describe civil society, including the unions, the proletariat, the poor, and more recently the internet or the blogosphere. It means to describe a loose model of internet-enabled publishing, such as WikiLeaks, and their concept of scientific journalism. Once newspapers were limited in what they could publish by the length of the page, digital technologies provide essentially unbounded capacity for hosting primary source documents. It is said that elements within said Fifth Estate see themselves in opposition to the mainstream media. I think this is actually now more than ever a very valid point. Do whistleblowers also constitute a Fifth Estate is my question, as the fate of a whistleblower is somehow inherently linked to an act of journalism. How are we to protect these primary sources of those people who have direct knowledge of an event that can hold other estates accountable, and also avoiding potential third-party gatekeeping? Are the watchdogs of the watchdogs a paradigm central to the pluralist democratic processes? Mr. Snowden said recently, if the NSA won't answer to Congress, they'll have to answer to the newspapers and ultimately to the people. So how to introduce these new gatekeepers and eliminate the old if these are no longer serving the public interest or are compromised? Especially now when we have seen that anyone who has access to a computer or the internet can contribute to the global political change. We find ourselves in the post-Snowden afterglow. Perhaps it is the beginning of the end of the age of secrecy. Let's hope. We are in information war. It is an age of industrial-sized leaks, and thanks to Chelsea Manning, we have witnessed the challenges it poses to the traditional media outlets, and the threat an outlet such as WikiLeaks poses to the establishment. In spite of all kinds of hardships, it remains a force to be contended with. This internet-enabled compound of networked individuals can expand and undermine the boundaries of existing institutions by crowdsourcing human resources. It is an embodiment of a network society by reconfiguring access to human and social interactions, by expanding the geography of access to information, and by eliminating old and introducing new gatekeepers. The current debate on whom is entitled to access, manage, disseminate information vital to the public's interests, such as in the Snowden revelations, bring this point home. Allegedly, Currently, new subsets of grassroots journalism and experimental systems are emerging. Hopefully Alexa O'Brien will also tell us, because it is possible to publish on the internet without the backing of a billionaire. She's a glaring example of that. That's my own personal opinion, by the way. It is possible to reveal truth as power. WikiLeaks is currently under an economic blockade, but it still manages to publish information vital to the public domain, as it's shown in its recent TTP leaks. If this is mainly a political problem that we're at, how to enact that political intervention and how to create agency, I think, is one of the most pressing questions of our time right now. And while I was researching for this panel, I came across the story of the first and most forgotten NSA whistleblower. His name is Perry Fellwalk. He was so far ahead of his time that no one believed him. And I will be quoting from an Adrian Chen article that I read in Gawker. I think it has uncanny parallels to the times that we are living in now. Fellwalk said, "I think we must take steps to ensure that there are no more Vietnams," he said. "I believe I have taken such a step. I have done it neither for money nor for glory, but to bring to the American people knowledge of what they need to know." So in the aftermath of the COINTELPRO in 1972, Fellwalk and Till Butts, a former Air Force intelligence officer and fellow anti-war activist, founded a new group by the name of the Committee for Action Research, or the Intelligence Community, or CARIC. Their goal shared some of the similarities that WikiLeaks would propose decades later: to watch the watchers by acting as a clearinghouse for information about surveillance and covert operations. This CARIC also anticipated WikiLeaks' intensive approach to uncovering information by treating journalism as a matter of data analysis. When Julian Assange has advanced the idea of scientific journalism based on publishing it all methodology with primary sources, CARIC developed what it was referred to as the New Intelligence, which aimed to be a mirror to be held up to the dark arts of the CIA and the FBI. Quote, "Only a full and undisguised look into this hidden world can displace unwarranted fears and guide the public effort to end this illegal and unjustified espionage." This was back then. This was an early CARIC handout. "The secrecy with which the government surrounds itself must end." At the end of this article, Perry Fellwalk said a very interesting thing here. He said, "This is not a good time. This is not a good time for our country. Most people in those days thought that the NSA and the CIA worked for the CIA. Excuse me. The NSA and the CIA worked for the US government, but they actually don't. They're an entity unto themselves, and they're a global entity that is comprised by the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes is the informal name for the intelligence sharing agreement between the United States, Great Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This community operates outside the Constitution," Fellwalk said, "and from everything I've seen, it still does. I do believe that there will always be people of conscience in the military and the intelligence community and other parts of government who will come forward and tell the American people that the emperor has no clothes, and that the government is committing crimes, and that the Constitution is being violated. The most fleeting thing in the world is a government secrecy when the government is in the wrong. The abuses of power by the NSA and the CIA have been known for the last 30 years, but you all forgot about them until WikiLeaks and Snowden. It is up to us and the young people today to decide how much of Big Brother and the wars for empire they want to take and what they're going to do about it." He said, "We, the movement, including Counterspy and the Fifth Estate," from Norman Mailer, "succeeded in ending the Nixon gang's reign of terror, and we helped end the war in Vietnam and colonialism in the Third World, and we continue to fight racism and sexism wherever those ugly diseases arose, and we shone light on the growing police state here at home. Those were great victories, and ones the movement can be justly proud of. Our failure was not in changing the entire, our failure, he says, was not in not changing the entire political, cultural, and economic system," he said, "as our generation believed we could. The system co-opted the counterculture, and reduced the blame for the war. And the NSA and CIA spying continues to this day. I thought that was a rather amazing statement. Thank you, Mr. Fawak, for blowing the whistle, too. Curiously enough, in 1973, Norman Mailer also was holding a party at the Four Seasons to celebrate his 50th birthday and also to launch and raise funds for a new venture which he called the Fifth Estate. And they, of course, were also infiltrated and had a lot of trouble, and they were taken down, and their demise, and they were relegated to the history books. Another exceptional leak that changed the course of history at that time was recently revealed in the New York Times story about people who broke into an FBI facility to steal the information about the COINTEL programs in 1971. The information they released revealed how J. Edgar Hoover was, as the head of the FBI, was abusing his position to gather information on politicians and civil rights leaders and used it against them. And that brought into effect the Church Committee. The great lessons that we can learn from the Church Committee today, because we're all looking about some sort of accountability programs, and this was back then in 1975, when the Senate Committee investigated intelligence agencies, was that the investigations took much too long. By 1975, unfortunately, Hoover was dead, and many of his most frightening secrets went into the grave with him. But just one reminder, when Obama said recently in his speech, he said, "In response to COINTELPRO, the surveillance abuses were curbed." Well, he forgot to mention that that was the work of leakers too. So let's fast forward a bit. WikiLeaks was launched in 2006. WikiLeaks maintained its own servers in undisclosed locations. It kept no logs. It used military-grade encryption to protect its sources and other confidential information. WikiLeaks considered itself as a protection intermediary, as a model. And rather than leaking directly to the press, they were fearing exposure and retribution. Whistleblowers could leak to WikiLeaks, and then these leaks, they would take it to the press for them. Chelsea Manning in 2010 leaked information to WikiLeaks, and Adrian Lamo informed on her. And Manning was arrested in May that same year, and Manning was held in prevention of injury maximum custody for 9 months, which was effectively solitary confinement and torture. Over the next 18 months, WikiLeaks would release hundreds of thousands of these logs, documents, the so-called Iraq war logs. The largest leak of classified information in the Defense Department's history, 250,000 unclassified, confidential, and secret US diplomatic cables, and 5 major news organizations, including the New York Times, The Guardian, El País, Le Monde, and Der Spiegel, partnered with WikiLeaks to run the stories based on the Manning documents. So we had the trial, and we had May 2013, where Snowden left Hawaii with the volumes of NSA material, which he had copied. He arrived in Hong Kong, where he joined Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. Glenn Greenwald reportedly said to The Guardian US editor-chief Janine Gibson, "I think I have the biggest intelligence leaks in a generation, if not ever." That must have been a hot conversation. The Guardian broke the story on the 9th of June, after several days of interviews, revealing his identity at his request. I quote, "I have no intention of hiding who I am because I know I have done nothing wrong." He said, "My sole motive is to inform the public as to which is done in their name and that which is done against them." Assange would disclose that WikiLeaks was paying for Snowden's travel and lodgings and providing him with legal counsel. In mid-June, the WikiLeaks editor and journalist Sarah Harrison arrived in Hong Kong and joined Snowden, and from this moment on, Assange and WikiLeaks became central to the Snowden story. WikiLeaks claimed that it had helped arrange for Snowden to gain political asylum in a democratic country. Snowden opted to distribute the documents he had copied to a selected few that are managing this information. Newspapers such as the Washington Post, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, O Globo, and El Telegrafo, and others have been managing the disclosure of the selected documents ever since that fateful day in June. Snowden said recently in an RID interview, "I leave it up to the discretion of the journalists to publish what they consider valuable information." So I think we're here today to discuss maybe how to rein in this monstrous surveillance apparatus. Snowden gave testimony to the European Parliament, as did Annie Michon, and a lot of extremely other amazing people. And soon we might expect there might be an inquiry in the German Bundestag. In this European Parliament report, it says, "It is very doubtful that the collection of so much information is only guided to fight against terrorism," the draft says, questioning the legality, necessity, and the proportionality of these programs. They said, "Recent revelations by the press, whistleblowers, and journalists, together with expert evidence given during this inquiry, have resulted in the compelling evidence of the existence of a far-reaching, complex, and highly technological advanced systems designed by the US and some member states' intelligence services to collect, store, analyze communication and metadata on all citizens around the world on an unprecedented scale in an indiscriminate and non-suspicious-based manner." So now what? Jacob Appelbaum said in his recent 30C3 talk, where he discusses the turmoil collection systems, he said, so the goal is non-attribution, the NSA, and total surveillance, and they want to do it completely in the dark. So that the NSA has 15 years of data retention, and that includes content as well as metadata. He says it is data totalitarianism, or to put it another way, it is totalitarianism. From wiretapping to a whole life surveillance, and 3 hops away, and uh-oh, that's you. So let's get started. And we have some very special guests to talk about this some more. I will begin with William Binney and then go on to Alexa O'Brien and then to Annie Machon. I will introduce them now. William Binney is a whistleblower, and he was a crypto mathematician, and he worked at the National Security Agency for almost 40 years, where he and an analyst, Kurt Wiebe, I hope I pronounced his name properly. What? Wiebe. I'm sorry, I have that German accent thing. Who worked also at the NSA for in excess of 30 years. They developed a revolutionary information processing system called Thin Thread that they believed could have detected and prevented 9/11 terrorist attacks. But the NSA officials ignored the Thin Thread in favor of Trailblazer, a much more expensive program that not only ended in total failure, but cost taxpayers billions of dollars. The Thin Thread was ready to deploy in January 2001, 8 months before the 9/11 attacks, but the NSA leadership, including the then director, General Michael Hayden, ignored the Thin Thread in favor of the Trailblazer program. In July 2007, the FBI conducted coordinated raids of each of the complainants of the DOD-IG report, and FBI's officers held a gun to Binney's head as he stepped naked from the shower. He watched how his wife and his youngest son, as the FBI ransacked his home. Binney and Wiebe disclosures continue to have a tremendous impact on the ongoing debate about the scope of the ever-expanding national security state. Thank you for being here today, Bill. I will introduce Annie. Annie Machon is a former MI5 spy who left the agency after blowing the whistle on the agency's illegal activities, and she is a pundit, a political campaigner, a PR consultant, an accomplished public speaker, and she is now engaged in launching a fund to offer financial supports to other whistleblowers called Courage, the Fund to Protect Journalistic Sources. Thank you, Annie, for being here today. And I have here Alexa O'Brien. She's a journalist, filmmaker, activist, digital media strategist, I found out today. And since 2012, she has provided an extensive archive of the only available transcripts of the WikiLeaks source Chelsea Manning's closed trial. She received in 2013 the Freedom of the Press Foundation grant for her coverage of the Chelsea Manning trial. For her outstanding work for Manning, she was shortlisted in the 2013 Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. I'd like to say one more thing, because I know the curators are going absolutely crazy here. Alexa O'Brien stands in a category apart for outstanding determination and journalistic excellence for having manually transcribed the Manning proceedings. And it is odd to note, and I read this through Chase Madar's book, because she was so good at it, the government thought it wasn't necessary to have court records at the time. I thought that was really extraordinary. They reasoned that she was so good at it, they did not need to make these court records public. The mistrial of Chelsea Manning was one of the most underreported stories of 2013, which is incongruent with its immense historical significance. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Bill Binney.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, although, as I keep saying, it's not really a pleasure to talk about this subject, because it's not a very pleasant subject. But I'd like to give you some of the background of how all this surveillance state that we have got started, and so you can understand the reaction of government against whistleblowers who were trying to expose it. First, I should set the stage by saying that I was designing systems, because most of the systems they're using to spy on everybody, I was designing and implementing. So the approach I was using was to use a targeted approach against known terrorists or known international criminals and people who might be in a social network type of array, be associated with them or in close proximity to them in this array, which meant you could focus in on a specific number of individuals in the world and not take in everybody in the world. So the idea was to do a targeted approach, but be able to see through all of the data. So we were designing ways and means, first being able to acquire, that was our big mistake, first being able to acquire the data to look at, and then have smart selection of that information out of there using the attributes of known terrorists and the known graph around them or social relationships, what meant people were close to them in proximity. The problem was we made it possible to take in all the data too. So in our approach, we were making things efficient so that our analysts wouldn't be buried with data. In other words, we made the volume problem in the world of the massive digital explosion a manageable problem. That meant our analysts could succeed. But when 9/11 happened, the sequence of events went like this. Hayden went to talk to Tenet, and Tenet asked Hayden what he could do. What could NSA do that would help them deal with terrorism around the world? That was the pretext, okay? Well, then they went to talk to Cheney because they said, hey, we have this program out here, we can do a lot of things with this program. And they went to Cheney, and Cheney said, gee, why don't we do everything? You know, he agreed to that process because the problem we made is we made it possible for them to capture everything being passed around the fiber optic lines. And when you do that, then that meant they could do virtually anything with the internet. Anybody sending anything. Even the public switch telephone network, you can do anything with it. You could capture everything in the world, which wasn't the objective we had. We had just to be able to see into it so we could filter out what was important that would stop terrorism and crime. But managed that together with George Bush signing off on that approach of collecting everything was the turning point to go to the dark side. And that was the decision that those four made centrally, and then it came down from above as the direction for NSA as to how they should proceed. And in the meantime, of course, I was still working there, I was getting ready, I was planning on leaving anyway because just the basic corruption in the place, okay? The fraud, waste, abuse, and corruption. And that was the foundation of our DODIG complaint, was about corruption. Which they found was the case eventually 5 years later. So as they were developing this process, they made it perfectly clear to all the people working in that area where I was that they weren't supposed to tell us about this program. Now, the reason they had to come to people working in my area was because the program that we developed jointly together with the contractors that were, I was the contract manager to do that as well. So they had to have the contractors who knew how the program worked to transfer it to other equipment down the hall and set it up so that it will function on the new data coming in. Initially, it was about US citizens, by the way, not foreigners. The initial attack was against US citizens. So I wasn't supposed to know about it, nor were my partner in the SIGINT Automation Research Center, Ed Loomis. He wasn't supposed to know about it either. It was all supposed to be kept really secret, even from us. But they couldn't really do that because, you see, they had to use our people to set it up. And of course, they were working with us still on things we had running in the lab. So they of course, relayed the fact that they were doing all this other work down the hall, on this other program called Stellar Wind, which was domestic spying, internal to the U.S. Now, at the same time that they started setting up the program at NSA, this is in September of 2001, the decision was made, I think, about no more than 4 days after 9/11. At the same time, the White House and their lawyers had to ensure that Congress and the courts would not interfere with this process. So they had to devise a way to make it, to keep it secret from the vast majority of the court and the Congress. And the way they did that was they called this program a covert program. An example of a covert program is like the killing of Osama bin Laden, or other operations in foreign countries where we go in to assassinate somebody or something like that. That's a covert operation. And that means that they can restrict knowledge of Congress to the Gang of Eight at a maximum. And that would limit Congress's view into the program. And so that's what they did. But this was a collection program, not an assassination program. So that initially they only told 4 members of Congress, that was the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. One of those members, of course, was Aunt Nancy Pelosi. She was the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. And so she bought into all these programs from the very beginning in September and October of 2001. Also the ones in CIA. And that's basically the reason she said impeaching George Bush is off the table when she was Speaker of the House. I mean, in order to introduce impeachment proceedings in the House, which is where they start, you have to have the Speaker's approval to bring it to the floor of the House. Well, of course, she couldn't let that happen because she was already culpable in the program. If she approved the impeachment of George Bush, she would have to approve her own impeachment because George Bush would say, hey, you're a part of this too. See, that's how they co-opted the leadership of Congress into this program. And this happened year after year as the members changed, so they had co-opted the vast majority of the leadership over the time into these programs. So now they all have to defend each other. Okay, that's really what's going on here. Now they all have to make sure this is covered up. Because if one falls, they all fall. And for the courts, they didn't bother telling anybody in any court until sometime in 2002, I believe it was early 2002. They told the ranking judge on the FISA Amendments Court, but again, had that judge swear to secrecy too. And of course, the judges nor could Congress members make any judgment on the program because they didn't really see how it was operating. They were only told, and they had to take their on trust what agency, the NSA, was telling them. So that set up this secret operation internally in our democracy, if you wanted to call it that at that point. But it followed on over time. They tried to get Congress to change different things like the FISA Amendments Act, and they had their secret interpretation of the Privacy Act. All of these things were an attempt to make legal what they were doing criminally since 2001. But in the meantime, all of the things that they're doing are resulting in lawsuits against the telecoms because they're violations of the law. Okay, they're handing over information about their customers is a violation of the law. It's also privacy laws and all that, and also FCC regulations governing telecoms and how they handle the data about their customers. So they had all these lawsuits. Incidentally, the penalty in the FISA laws for violating the privacy rights of U.S. citizens is up to 5 years in jail and up to $10,000 for each occurrence. Well, since the telecoms were, performing about 5 to 6 billion occurrences every day, that would have bankrupted them rather quickly. So that's why Congress had to pass retroactive immunity to the telecoms for all the crimes they were committing. Okay, I mean, you can't hold the government immunity. They would claim we're sovereign. You have no right to sue us under this is national security and all that. That was the argument they would make. But these are the reasons they were doing these things, and how they co-opted the courts in. Because when it came out in 2005 that that this program was running with warrantless wiretaps and data mining and all that. That's when it came out in the New York Times. And then about 1 week after that, just before Christmas in 2005, Judge Robertson on the FISA court quit. Now he did that, of course, because he felt like he was a puppet out there just for show, because they were subverting the entire process. Now, no one really talked about it, but the FBI was using this data since 2001. And this data to date, by the way, includes content. I've said this all along. They're collecting all of your email. Any data you've been sending on the fiber optic lines, they're collecting. It came out recently about the messaging. They have a few 100 million of those every day. Well, they're doing billions of emails every day, and they have been for over 12 years. So this is an aspect that's not been done. That the content aspect hasn't been talked about, nor has the police use of this data been talked about. They're not really doing it for terrorism. They're doing it for law enforcement worldwide, because this is data about the population, everybody, and this is perfect for law enforcement. So, at any rate, we were watching all of this and from the very beginning, I'd worked the Soviet Union for almost 30 years, and it was obvious to me that this was a totalitarian state procedure because, this is what is traditionally, how many times do we have to learn this lesson? This has been over centuries and millennia we've been doing this. History has recorded this so many times, it's not funny. Why we don't recognize it immediately is just unfathomable to me. I just can't understand it. But this is obviously what it was to me, and I objected immediately. I found out about it in the second week of October of 2001, and it was clear I could not stay there with that. And they twisted. What they did was, if we had brought into the data in our system as we originally built it and it was running, if U.S. citizens came into that data, for example, it was against the law, against the Constitution, we had a process there to encrypt any of that data to ensure privacy so that nobody could tell who they were. The FBI could not go into the database and get data on anybody out because it was all encrypted and they couldn't find it. And that was one of the first things they got rid of. Because they needed to find it for law enforcement, okay? That was the point. And so we quit NSA as fast as we could. Took 2.5 weeks to get out of there. Fortunately, they offered an early out at the time, and that we jumped on that. Otherwise, we had a paperwork problem. It would take probably a month to get out of the place. So after we got out, we started complaining to the House Intelligence Committee, because it was their job to monitor the intelligence community agencies and make sure they didn't spy on U.S. citizens or violate any other law, of all of which they were doing. And of course, they weren't supposed to know about it either. So we were notifying them about programs that they weren't supposed to know about because it was a covert program, okay? That was the whole point. Cheney and Tenet and Hayden and Bush wanted to keep it secret, so secret that nobody could do anything about it. That's subverting our entire constitutional process and our entire democracy, which is what they did, and they're still doing it too. So, so then we kept trying with different people in Congress. We went outside the intelligence agency, the intelligence committees in Congress, simply because they weren't going to do anything, and we saw zero action there. So we attempted to see the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Justice Rehnquist, and this. We knew we couldn't get there going directly because the staffs would divert it. So a friend of ours that we met we had a contract he was working with the NRO at the time, and we were working with them, and we knew him, and he grew up and went to high school with the daughter of Chief Justice Rehnquist. So we had an avenue to get a message to him, at least to get an audience to convey our clear fear of what was going on here, under the assumption that he didn't know, and nobody else in the courts knew anyway, so it was right that he didn't know. So we tried to letter through his daughter to him to try to get an audience with him, just to express all the concern we had about the unconstitutional activity going on at NSA. This was early 2002, so you keep it in the time frame. And we never got an answer from that, and I always thought that was orchestrated by the staff, because when that kind of thing happens, the Chief Justice would talk to his staff members, and the staff would go then call the House Intelligence Committee, because we had it, Diane Rourke was with us in the House Intelligence Committee to try to do this, and say, what is this requested meeting all about? And I'm sure the senior members of the staff on the House Committee would say, don't pay any attention to them, because, they're just disgruntled about something, or give some excuse to avoid any meeting, which would, again, allow plausible deniability for the Chief Justice. In other words, he never heard about it, so he couldn't have done anything about it, if it ever came out. So we tried that, and then we of course, we wrote our complaint to the Department of Defense Inspector General, and we tried, so eventually we even ended up going to the Department of Justice Inspector General, again with the same complaint. We're trying to do this all within the existing channels, which was outlined, by the way, as grounds for employment with the U.S. government. You have to report fraud, waste, abuse, and illegality, and here's where you do it, and these are the routes that you do it. This is established procedure by the government. Okay, so we were following established procedure. And we did that for approximately the better part of 7 years. And all that did was raise our visibility to NSA and the FBI and the Department of Justice. After all, the attorney generals all along were culpable in this, because they were signing off on this procedure too. So it wasn't just the president that was involved, or a vice president, or his staffs, or the House and Senate Intelligence Committee chairs and ranking members, but it was also the Department of Justice and all the leaders in the agencies. They were all a part of this. And as time moves on, you see the leaders and the intelligence committees rotate, so you get more people drawn in to being culpable in it too. So over time, they had a lot of leadership of Congress in both houses and Senate involved in this. So you see how, and this is the state today. This is what's really the problem. We have so many people who are part of it that have to cover their ass for the crimes they've committed. And that they can go out and say things like, we need to hold Snowden accountable for what he's done. Well, what about the crimes you've committed? Are you accountable or not? All of them. In my view, and I think it's under Article 5 of the Constitution, we need a states convention where we vote in an amendment to the Constitution, which can be done by the states and the people, where we have an avenue for the people of the United States to appoint a special prosecutor to go after the entire government. I mean, that's the only way out of this, because they're all a part of it. See, that's the problem. They're all culpable in this. I mean, how else could you get a court to issue a general order like that Verizon order, which is a general order? He's issuing an order to turn over the records of over 100,000 U.S. citizens. I mean, you have to look at it from our side. We have to look at it, what is a violation of our law? Okay, well, that is a violation of our law, our Constitution. So you have to look at it from that perspective as a legal attack, because internationally they don't have any law that says we have to restrict our collection on foreign intelligence. The president has an open-ended capability there. So, but my argument in that case was that it's pointless to copy and collect information about everybody in the world, because it's all irrelevant to the real issues at hand, and they need a focused attack. And stop burying your analysts and making them dysfunctional, make them functional and succeeding. That's why we missed the Boston bomber, the Fort Hood shooter, the bomber in Times Square, the underwear bomber. We missed the real ones, but we pick up people who we can entice into, coerce into thinking they can do it by the FBI's entrapment, okay? That we succeed at. We can entrap people, but we can't stop the real guys. Why? Because we're buried in useless information. So that's the procedure we went through, and then in 2007 they decided we were making too much noise around, so we had to be attacked. So that's what they sent the FBI at us for. And to ensure that we stayed silent, they had the Department of Justice fabricate evidence from just emails and social networking, metadata, if you will, combinations to show you that you're cooperating with other people. They started fabricating a conspiracy charge, right? Well, first they started with we stole intellectual capital. Yes, I walked out with my brain, Okay? That was the basic charge. Okay, the other thing is we stole, or we had intellectual property that belonged to somebody else. Well, we didn't have that, so they had it. So, and then they just started to put together a conspiracy charge. Because we had a meeting, we were going to attack Medicare and Medicaid fraud, because we thought we could make a little money there, you know. There's a 30% finder's fee if you find, you know, save them money. If you save them $1 billion, you get $300 million, okay? That's the idea.
Is that whistleblower incentivization in the U.S., or?
I'm sorry?
Whistleblower incentivization?
Yeah, well, this is a killer. See, when you expose the dirty laundry, they have to kill you every way they can. All right, so we thought we could make maybe $20 billion in the first year with the email, with the Medicare Medicaid fraud. But because we met as a group, that was a conspiracy to expose classified information of the U.S. government. See, so they were trumping up a charge, and they told our lawyers they were going to indict us with that. So you know, I had a little talk with Tom Drake, and I passed all the information over to him, where I was assembling evidence of malicious prosecution. And so when I did that, I did it on the phone because I knew his phone was tapped. And then that way I got the information to the FBI, would pass it on to the DOJ, and you know, the DOJ would then realize that when they took us into court on this charge, why they would be countercharged with malicious prosecution and face a felony charge. So they dropped it. That was a month later, we got immunity letters. And I made sure the immunity letters said that from all the investigation of the material available to us, we have nothing that indicates you did anything wrong, okay? So I made sure I wasn't going to sign unless it said that. But at the same time, there are still good people working in the DOJ, okay? Obviously, somebody in there felt really bad about what they were trying to do to us. So they sent us a draft copy of their indictment of us. So we have the draft copy, which is further evidence of malicious prosecution of the Department of Justice of the United States, fabricating evidence, framing us, trying to put us in jail and get us out. The only reason we're not in jail is because we were smart enough to maintain backups and evidence that would show that exculpatory evidence to show that we weren't planning on what they were saying we were doing. That's the only reason. Otherwise, we could be in jail now. I could still be in jail. But it's the idea that the Department of Justice, the highest level of the United States government, legally, was going to frame us. Now, what kind of people does that take? I refer to these as very low, shallow, fake characters. All of them. From the Attorney General of the United States all the way down. At any rate, they didn't succeed at that, fortunately, so I'm here with you today. Otherwise, I might not be. But so that ended up, they gave us letters of immunity, and then that was the thing that made me decide that the entire system was so corrupt and so subverted that I had to go outside the government. There was no way it was going to fix itself, so I had to go public, and that I started doing in 2011. And it's only gotten better. Laura Poitras has helped me. She helped me along, saying, "Bill, why don't you go over here and do this? You know, go on Democracy Now. Go up here and have a teach-in and so on."
That op-doc was also amazing with the New York Times op-doc.
Yes.
That was really tremendous.
Jane Mayer's article. Yeah,
Excellent.
and then Jim Bamford got involved. And when Jim Bamford got involved, see, that added that extra credibility to it, okay? Because he's the acknowledged public expert of the NSA. So when he started saying things, people started listening, and that made a difference there. And then it just started accelerating from there. So, and then Snowden came out with these paperworks and showing the PRISM program. And a lot has been made about the companies involved in that, but they're ignoring that upstream collection system, which is all the fiber optic taps and all the implants, the 50,000 plus implants in the switches and servers around the world, which meant NSA owned the entire network, and they could take anything from anywhere in the world remotely. That was that's where they're getting all the content as well as metadata. But they can't cover everything, so they have a percentage. My estimate was they only got 80% of it. They missed about 20, and that's where the PRISM program filled in the holes, the 20% holes. So that was the story of how this went along, and ultimately it ended up in lawsuits. I signed a sworn affidavit that they were doing all this for the lawsuit, EFF lawsuit, Juul versus NSA. That's still in the courts, and it's trying to work its way up to the Supreme Court because it's challenging the constitutionality of NSA doing this. And the government has been fighting like hell to keep that out of court. They claimed you don't have standing. They can't do that now. And because of Snowden, he made that impossible. And also, there's another one that was that was recently thrown out of the Supreme Court called Amnesty International versus Clapper. That one was thrown out of court, but in the process, the Solicitor General lied to the Supreme Court to get that out, to get that thrown out. And he's now scrambling around trying to fix that lie. What he said was, if any NSA information was ever used to prosecute a person in court, that person would be told. The reason they have to do that is because of the right of the defendant to do the discovery challenge. Discovery meaning the basic information that the police use to arrest you. How do they acquire it, and so on. That was the challenge of Clapper versus Amnesty International. So he lied and said they would be told if that information was used. Well, nobody's ever been told. So, and they've been using it, according to Senator Feinstein, several hundred times a year. So, you know, when they talk about nobody's been hurt about this or hurt by this program, that's an outright lie too. I mean, look at what they did to us. If you don't call that hurt, look at what they did to Tom Drake. They nearly broke him. The same thing. They fabricated evidence. They falsified evidence. And if you don't think, I mean, you have to stop and realize what's happening here is they're subverting the entire process of our Constitution and democracy and spreading that around the world because this information is shared with other partners. They call it collaborating partners, but they don't tell them again the source. They do a parallel construction and substitute that and lie about that. That's why I called that a planned program perjury policy, because they have a plan, they've got a program, and they've got a policy that is advocating and demanding that all the people involved perjure themselves in court, and that's what they've been doing. So I'm looking at it not just as the destruction of the United States government and our democracy, but everybody's, because that's happening throughout the world. And that's the experience I had, was that basically those in power who've committed all these crimes will do anything they have to, and they don't care what law they break. They'll do it if they can suppress the whistleblower and keep what they're doing secret. I mean, after all, that's what they're doing with the law. We have a secret court making secret decisions about us and making secret constitutional decisions and making secret interpretations of laws and supporting that. That's a secret government. That's not a democracy. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. I don't know about you, but I have goosebumps. I'd like to, present Alexa, who'd like to tell us about
Chelsea Manning.
Chelsea Manning. Okay, thanks.
Microphone? Oh, yeah, I do. Sorry. Hello. Can you hear me? Okay. It's interesting, your comments about the Clapper case. The standing issue in that case has actually affected the case that I'm party to, which is the Hedges v. Obama against the National Defense Authorization Act. The language of material support is now morphed. Material support for terrorism is now morphed into substantial support. Well, what does that mean when President Obama is calling the president of Yemen asking that a Yemeni a journalist who's printing the truth about U.S. cluster bombing, secret cluster bombing, that he remain in prison because he has a tie to al-Qaeda, because he interviewed al-Qaeda. In the course of my activities as a journalist and as a citizen, I hate the term activist, as a citizen engaged in public, discourse in the civic space, private security contractors tried to tie me to al-Qaeda, which is ridiculous. So it's very, very interesting when you mention that.
That's a standard KGB tactic too, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, and I'm sure the Stasi did that. I mean, anything to deflect from them to you. Like they're trying to say Snowden was now a party with the Russian, because they want to apply the 1917 Espionage Act against them, which, in order to do that, they have to show an association with a foreign power. So they're doing that just to make that argument.
Absolutely, the reason to believe, yeah. I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear Annie, because I came here to hear Binny and Annie. So I'm going to just give me a nudge so that people can definitely hear them, because they're great. I want to talk to you about Chelsea Manning. For those of you who don't know who Chelsea Manning is, she was formerly named Bradley Manning. She was an American soldier who was responsible for the largest leak of U.S. government information and intelligence about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as U.S. diplomacy across the globe. But I want to talk to you about Manning's intentions. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about her in the context of the state. The state does not have an ethical or a moral imperative. As described in the Martens Clause relating to the laws of war, or even Federalist Number 52, which is the basis for the reasoning of, for the U.S. Constitution, the legitimacy of a law or policy, indeed the state itself, derives itself from its dependence on the public conscience. The individuals that own this office are in the business of catching shitbags. Read a sign above the targeting section in the intelligence shop near eastern Baghdad, Iraq, where Chelsea, formerly Bradley Manning, worked. If you think for 1 second you can come in here and bug us with your sissy shit, you might want to rethink your life. Cynicism and a lack of critical thought defined the ethos of the intelligence shop at Fobhammer, Iraq, where she worked. The sissy shit that disturbed Manning was how illegal killing and violence are sustained by organizational ineptitude and public ignorance. Unlike other soldiers who did not have access to classified information, Manning had the benefit and the burden of knowing the truth and having a conscience. Manning was ordered to use the intelligence that she had access to on the secret DoD network and to incorporate that intelligence into her work products. And she did that. But she was in a double bind because her conclusions were not in line with US propaganda. The 2nd Brigade's mission, which is essentially Manning's brigade, the mission in Iraq was to train the Iraqi Federal Police. The partnership included intelligence sharing. The 2nd Brigade also shared intelligence with the Iraqi Presidential Brigade and the National Iraqi Intelligence Agency. Classified computers in the 2nd Brigade's intelligence shop were equipped specifically with CD burners so that US forces could distribute intelligence to Iraqi partners. Iraq's intelligence and law enforcement agencies were divided amongst sectarian and political lines since the restructuring of the Iraq state after the US-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein's regime in 2003. The Bush administration had authorized the creation of the Iraqi National Intelligence Service, the INIS, and Congress earmarked $3 billion for its operations between 2003 and 2007. Some of the money wound up supporting paramilitary units that effectively became Shiite-dominated militias and death squads, carrying out personal and political vendettas in their search for insurgents who supported Saddam Hussein. template for the US-backed counterinsurgency is what journalist Peter Moss has called the Salvadorization of Iraq, a reference to US proxy wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 1980s. And US military counterinsurgency experts had reportedly advised the newly formed Iraqi Special Police Commandos. The Guardian reported in March 2013 that the Iraqi Special Police Commandos, quote, conducted some of the worst acts of torture during the US occupation and accelerated the country's descent into full-scale civil war. When Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki of the Shiite Islamic Dawa Party came to power in 2006, he mistrusted the CIA-funded INIS, which was headed by a Sunni who led a failed CIA-backed coup back in 1996. So al-Maliki subsequently established his own intelligence agency headed by a Shiite under the Ministry of State for National Security Affairs. Fueled by the competing spheres of influence between the US and Iran, Sunni and Shiite factions within both the INIS and the MSNS conducted systematic campaigns to eliminate rivals in an escalating battle for influence and control over the intelligence and security apparatus in Iraq. 3 weeks after her trip, Chelsea Manning's trip to Barnes & Noble in Rockville, Maryland, where she uploaded to WikiLeaks via their anonymous submission system low-level battlefield reports from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, she was ordered to investigate the arrest of 15 individuals at a printing press in the Qarada Peninsula of Baghdad. There couldn't be a greater metaphor of this story. I mean, I feel like is at the core. To me, Manning is the 16th detainee arrested at a printing press, and Snowden is the 17th, and Assange is the 18th. And I mean, like, so the detentions of these individuals had been a joint operation between subordinate commands of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team and the Iraqi Federal Police. The IFP accused the detainees of publishing anti-Iraqi literature, and she was told to find out who the bad guys were. So Manning established through her intelligence and her own mental intelligence and then the intelligence she was provided that none of these detainees had any ties to suspected terrorists or militia groups, nor were they carrying out anti-Iraqi activities. In fact, Manning was a Shia militia expert. That was her job in Iraq. Pictures from the scene of the arrest included images of the 15 suspects, pallets of unprinted paper, and high-resolution copies of the printed material that they had sought to publish. So when Manning had the anti-Iraqi literature translated, it turned out to be a benign treatise on public corruption in al-Maliki's government entitled, "Where Did the Money Go?" Which is sort of like the title of like Occupy 2, Where Did the Money Go? Or anyway, your treatise to the Inspector General was probably entitled, Where Did the Money Go? Upon discovering the discrepancy, Manning informed her command that the detainees were dissidents and not militants. Manning's superiors told her to drop it and just assist them and the Iraqi Federal Police in finding out where these print shops are that are printing anti-Iraqi literature. In court, Manning told Lind, "I knew that if I continued to assist the Baghdad Federal Police in identifying the political opponents of Prime Minister al-Maliki, these people would be arrested and in the custody of a special unit of the Baghdad Federal Police and very likely tortured and not seen again for a very long time, if ever." Around the time that Manning was tasked to investigate these 15 Iraqi detainees, her brigade commanders at headquarters, because they're very smart there, began feeling that the soldiers were too focused on the ground and they needed to maintain the big picture. So the highest ranking intelligence officer in the brigade, Captain Stephen Lim, directed Manning to send his intelligence analysts a link to the State Department's net-centric diplomacy database, which later became known as Cablegate. It housed diplomatic cables from across the globe. Most of them are unclassified. In fact, these cables are distributed amongst at least 500,000 US government contractors and federal employees. So this is not closely held information. This is widely distributed amongst people in the US government. The day after the arrest of the 15 detainees, the US Embassy in Baghdad sent a cable to the CIA, the National Security Council, and other US agencies reporting that al-Maliki had fired 376 officers from the Iraqi security and intelligence services and replaced them with, quote, inexperienced political officers loyal to his party. The embassy said that al-Maliki, was positioning his own people within the intelligence agencies to eliminate internal opposition in the run-up to the elections, because the other mission of the 2nd Brigade Combat Team was election security, because at the time, the Iraqi elections were taking place. So Iraqi and American observers said the cable found this development very troubling. After WikiLeaks published the Iraq war logs, Amnesty International and the United States Special Rapporteur on Torture urged President Barack Obama to order an investigation into the complicity of US forces in handing detainees over to the Iraqi security forces, who then tortured them. US authorities failed to investigate hundreds of reports of torture, rape, and even murder by Iraqi police and soldiers whose conduct appears to have been systemic and normally unpunished. According to another Guardian report published in January 2012, the Iraqi security officers were systematically arresting people on trumped-up charges, torturing them, and extorting bribes from their families for their release. Likewise, in a McClatchy Tribune report published in June of 2012, al-Maliki security services were found to have detained more than 1,000 members of the opposing political parties, many of them in secret locations with no access to legal counsel, using brutal torture to extract confessions. So caught in the double bind of an executive overburdened with secrecy and amorality, Manning's conscience compelled her to appeal to a higher law, not even her own moral conscience, the public conscience. For disclosing low-level, I'm sorry, I find myself, I think I have to share this with the other people who watch this trial. Deeply affects me. For disclosing low-level intelligence and unclassified information, much of this information was not even classified, to the public about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and U.S. diplomacy across the globe, Manning received 35 years in prison. Acquitted of aiding the enemy, for which she faced life. She was eventually convicted of espionage, exceeding authorized access, stealing U.S. government property, and wanton publication. A new charge, it's never been used before. They're making up charges now. Whistleblowers in U.S. intelligence have no legal means of publicly disclosing classified information about how the state illegally or wrongfully employs violence. When they do, they face the severest retaliation from the state's own hands. If you are a member of the military and you are in uniform, the expectation is you will make the disclosure through your chain of command, said Dan Meyer, from the Pentagon's Director of Whistleblowing and Transparency. He actually works at the DODIG, which is where she can disclose classified information. But her lawyer, David Coombs, explains that Manning knew the system. She understood that if you went through the so-called legitimate channels, the information is still going to remain in the government, and it's not going to be released to the public. The issue of why the information should be kept secret would never be addressed, he added. To date, the Military Whistleblower Protection Act of 1988, under which Manning would have fallen, has created more victims than it has helped, said Tom Devine of the Legal Center for the Government Accountability Project. The U.S. Congress has recently attempted to approve the law, which is intended to protect military whistleblowers from retaliation by co-workers and their superiors. But Manning faced retaliation by the state itself. Prior to her trial, the very people who she would have had protected communications with about this, which she really actually couldn't, because she couldn't disclose classified information over policy issues. So this is important. She didn't have legal options, essentially.
I just want to say one thing, like what he also says, we are a clear example, going through the proper channels doesn't work. He's also said this, Benny said that. Yeah. Sorry.
I'd like to add one thing here. A lot of people haven't brought this up, but the Executive Order 13526, governing classification for the United States government,
Yeah.
Section 1.7, says you may not use classification to cover up a crime, fraud, waste, abuse, corruption, or embarrassment.
Right.
Collateral murder video was a crime.
It was a
You
crime.
can't
It was a war
classify
crime.
that. By their regulation.
Thank
The
you.
issue here is the judiciary fundamentally has the oversight over the classification issue, but if it's considered to be national security, I mean, in theory, that's what it says, but the reality of it is that,
Yeah, I know.
yeah, it doesn't work.
I know, but see, this executive order covers national security.
No, I know what 135, believe me, I have that's 2 years
I mean,
with the Manning
that's-
trial. I mean, that was constantly cited in court, so.
Yeah, but that is to me was an obvious crime. I mean, they just murdered those people. That's murder.
It was a war crime.
The U.S. Congress has recently attempted to approve the law which is intended to protect, but in the case of Manning, we had the president, the commander-in-chief herself, himself, the head of the executive branch declaring Manning guilty before trial by saying that she broke the law before trial. And Martin Dempsey and other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff also did the similar thing. So her chain of command, the uppermost command who should have been protecting her at that time for a fair trial were actually declaring her guilty. And members of Congress were calling for her execution because she was charged with aiding the enemy. Although acquitted of it, she could have faced the death penalty. Ultimately, it was recommended at trial that she face life imprisonment. Official channels for military whistleblowers only protect internal disclosures of classified information that comport with the law, says Jesslyn Raddick from the Government Accountability Project. But comporting with the law means U.S. prosecutors will argue that the non-disclosure agreements with government employees sign when they apply for security clearances override their First Amendment rights. Simply because you believe, this is a judge's ruling, simply because you believe that something that is going on that's classified should be revealed to the press and the public, this is the legal precedent, so that the public can know that its government is doing something that you think is wrong, doesn't justify publicly disclosing it, wrote Judge Ellis III in another espionage case. Noble motives don't erase the violation. That's his language. So at her trial, Manning was not allowed to explain the reasons for her disclosures or her good faith intentions to inform the public. The lack of transparency in the Manning court-martial raises serious questions about the justice of her conviction. The trial record is considered to be the longest in military law, 45,000 pages. 18 months into the legal proceeding, the public was still forbidden access to over 30,000 pages of court filings. We had no government rulings. We didn't even have a formal copy of her plea, which had different dates. So the entire sort of drama of the court martial was unknown to the public. Everyone just assumed, oh, she pled to 10 lesser included offenses, she pled guilty. It was awful. Yeah. The charge of aiding the enemy is one of two punitive articles under the Uniform Code of Military Justice that applies to you and to me and to Manning and to everyone, according to the U.S. government. So this fact alone was reasons why we had a right, and we still have a right to the public record, to see what kind of legal precedent, a broad legal precedent has been established by prosecuting her on that, even though she was acquitted. Undoubtedly, U.S. service members who have been deployed to war zones like Manning have witnessed numerous law of war violations and their fair share of horrific conduct. Despite only accounting for 10% of the overall civilian population, 1 in 5 suicides in the U.S. is by a U.S. veteran. Whether increased suicide rates among veterans is due to ethical or moral dilemmas is unknown, but some have publicly credited Manning's disclosures with helping to end the Iraq War because they prevented the Obama administration from securing immunity for U.S. soldiers in 2011. Manning is confined at the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Kansas. Her case must be reviewed by the current convening authority, which is Major General Jeffrey Buchanan. This process is referred to as taking the action. In taking the action, Buchanan has the power to disapprove any conviction or reduce Manning's sentence. Once Buchanan does this, this case will be automatically appealed to the court, the Army Court of Criminal Appeals, but it's going to take years. Instead of waiting for years for the legal process to review the case, Manning's defense attorney has filed an application seeking a presidential pardon. But the Obama administration has recently reportedly chosen to table Manning's application until the appeals process is complete. Given the inaction by the Obama administration, it appears that doing your ethical and patriotic duty by appealing to the public conscience is something that she did at her own peril.
Thank you, Alexa.
Since I was in the Army during the Vietnam War in 1965 to 69, there's a parallel to what was happening, for example, with the Collateral Murder movie, and that was the My Lai massacre.
Exactly. Cy Hirsch.
And at that time, they brought Cowley on, Lieutenant Cowley on for a trial, and they tried and convicted him. But in the process, the Department of Defense issued an order to all the military that said they are not to follow illegal orders. That happened back then. So it was a policy statement to everybody in the military. What's the policy statement after the collateral murder? We don't have one. So the policy seems to be, we'll kill anybody we want.
If you look at Manning's disclosures, like the Guarani airstrike, which has never been published, not the video because she was found not guilty of that, but the documents related to the mass civilian casualties from this bombing, you can actually see that there are several fragmentary orders. And a recent article in The Nation, they must have got it through FOIA or some of them or a report on them, but these are the primary source documents that would show the internal military conflict over how to actually follow these orders that were creating massive casualties in Afghanistan.
Yeah, but again, I would say our government still needs to make a policy statement here. They've left that blank. The impression they're giving the world is that we'll kill anybody.
And impunity rules. None of these soldiers get.
Right.
They get
Well,
off.
there was a criminal investigation of the soldiers involved, and they were found. There was no. There was Army 15-6 of the pilots.
Yeah, I know, but
Right.
I was waiting for the policy statement like the one after My Lai, and we
Right.
just never got one.
Okay, I'd like to go on to Eddie Michon now. Yes, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes. We have 10 minutes for questions. We're cutting a bit short on the questions. I'm sorry.
We are indeed. It's some very interesting points about the policy as well. I mean, I think in this country, a policy statement was issued shortly after the Second World War at the Nuremberg trials, which means that you can't rely on just following orders as legal defense, and that is enshrined under international law. Why are our countries not going back to that basic principle? Okay, well, it's a harrowing story, and it makes me all the more determined to try and fight to protect future journalistic sources and future whistleblowers, but I'll get on to that in about 15 minutes or so, if you'll bear with me. I could not resist. Thank you very much to the organisers for asking me to speak at this event on three of my favourite topics, which have grandiose titles in the heading for the speech, but actually is spies, geeks, and the media. Three of my all-time favourite topics, and I've been given licence to be as rude as I want about the old media this afternoon, so let's get to it. The reason I want to do that, I am a whistleblower of the old school, way back in the 1990s, almost 20 years ago now. I was employed as a British intelligence officer working for the UK Domestic Security Service, MI5. And I met there my former partner and colleague, a man called David Shayler, who became a very infamous or very famous whistleblower in the late 1990s. We worked there in MI5 for 6 years each. And it was the marginally golden ethical era of their 100-year existence, because they'd only just been put on a legal footing for the first time. They had not officially existed up until 1989. And of course, this was prior to 9/11, when the intelligence gloves came off around the planet, and MI5 and the CIA and all the other alphabet soup agencies slithered down a moral decline towards torture and kidnapping and drone assassination attacks. So for about 10, 12 years, they tried to do good, almost. But despite that, and despite only working there for 6 years, we saw so many things going wrong that we felt, even then, compelled to resign and compelled to go to the media to expose the crimes we had witnessed. Now, I won't dwell too long on those, but just as headlines, we saw files being held on government ministers, our top politicians. In fact, the very people who went on to become the political masters of the UK spy agencies had information held on them by those spy agencies, which is a dreadful problem, I think, for a democracy. It's very much a tail wagging the dog. We also saw thousands, hundreds of thousands of files held on innocent UK citizens for their political beliefs, their democratic actions. We saw illegal telephone taps against journalists. We saw innocent people being imprisoned on trumped-up charges, despite the fact that MI5 had evidence they were innocent, but they failed to disclose that evidence to court. We saw provisional IRA bombs exploding on UK streets, which could and should have been prevented by the secret police and by MI5. And then the spies lying to their government masters to cover up these mistakes. So they never learnt from those mistakes. And the whole time there culminated in the case that made us quit. And this became known as the Gaddafi assassination plot, which occurred in 1996. Now here this was MI6, which is sort of James Bond foreign intelligence agency, a bit like the CIA. They were involved in funding and helping to arrange an assassination attempt against Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. And to do this, they actually funded what they called a ragtag group of Islamic extremists in Libya, which even then were known to MI5 and MI6 as Al-Qaeda. They funded this group to try and carry out an attack against Gaddafi, which was illegal under UK law, which manifestly went wrong because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated by the very same agencies and organizations in 2011, and it also killed innocent people, innocent bystanders on the street. So we couldn't think of anything more heinous than this. We had not signed up to an intelligence community in Britain to become involved in what was effectively state-sponsored terrorism, which kill innocent people abroad. So we resigned and we blew the whistle. Now, under UK law, if you go public, it's a bit like with the military laws in the US. It is very black and white. You sign what is called the Official Secrets Act, which means that you cannot say anything about your work to anyone ever outside the agencies. Otherwise, you are breaking the Official Secrets Act and you face imprisonment. So what to do? It was a risk. We decided to go public. We approached the newspapers. They ran with the stories. This was in the late 1990s. And as a result, we ended up literally going on the run around Europe. We were proto-Snowdens. We preemptively went on the run before the story broke. We ended up living in hiding, literally in the far south of France, for a year. We ended up living in exile for a total of 3 years. And my former partner, David Shayler, went to prison not once but twice. First of all, when the British failed to extradite him from France to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act in 1998. And then secondly, after he had voluntarily returned to the UK in order to face trial and in order to have a proper investigation initiated into the assassination plot against Gaddafi. And he was found guilty inevitably, and he went to prison again. So he was inside, not for very long. I mean, we weren't facing things like 35 years in prison, which is just totally disproportionate. But he was still facing 6 years and ended up serving 6 months in total. But I suppose what was worse was some lessons we learned from that era of our life. And first of all, was the lack of privacy, because this is one of the things we're here to discuss today, this nature of surveillance, the nature of this panopticon that we now find ourselves inadvertently living under. And because we put ourselves in a rather unusual situation 15, 16 years ago by blowing the whistle and annoying the spies and being pursued across Europe, we know what it's like to be watched constantly, to be surveyed, to be spied on. And I say that in every which way, and this is of course the analog era as well. So, the capabilities are far greater now. But even then we knew that our telephones were being intercepted. We knew that our emails were read. We knew that we could not rely on privacy in our own home. The idea that we wanted to have a conversation in our living room or go to the bedroom, even that we could not assume was private. And also we found out afterwards that some of our friends had been pressured by the secret police and the spies to report on us. They were forced to report back to the spy agencies. So we were being watched every which way in those days. And I have to say that even though you try and blank it out, even though you try and joke about it and say, I'm having more fun than they are, who cares? It is still very corrosive to feel that everything you say, everything you do is being watched and listened to. And you start to self-censor. And it inhibits normal social relations as well. So, for example, if I wanted to have a private conversation about a family matter with my mother or something, we inhibited our conversation because we could not guarantee we had privacy, even for that. So it's a very corrosive situation. And it irritates me now when we have a situation where people say, well, if you've got nothing wrong, if you're doing nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide. It doesn't matter, because the very fundamental is not about whether you're doing anything wrong. Well, two issues. One, you might not be doing anything wrong now, but roll forward 5, 10 years, what you're doing now might then be deemed to be a crime. So, for example, you're out there demonstrating or part of an Occupy camp, or you're an activist on the streets or something, perfectly legitimate nowadays, but in 5 or 10 years, the law might have changed and you might be deemed to be a domestic extremist or a terrorist. And we all know what happens to terrorist suspects these days. So, of course, everything being hoovered up, everything being stored, means that any information of what you do now can retroactively be used against you in the future. But it's more about a principle as well. After the Second World War, we had the principle of privacy enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and for a very, very good reason. Because if you don't feel you have that privacy in what you read, in what you write, in what you say, in what you watch, in what you plan as active citizens, then you will again start to self-censor in what you do. And that means democracy has died. So that is the nature of what it's like to live under surveillance, and why, in my view, it is so fundamentally important to a functioning democratic way of life. But the other thing that I learned as well, coming out of the whistleblowing years, and this is where I get to talk about my favourite subject, the media. Because it was bad enough to watch my partner being prosecuted and going to prison twice for exposing the crimes of others, and they were never even arrested or questioned about it. But then what happened to him in the media, the old media, this is pre, the Fifth Estate, was actually worse. It was a sort of personality rape, I think is the best way of putting it, where at the end of his court case, the judge said he agreed that Mr. Shaler had done what he'd done in the public interest, there was no financial motivation, and that no lives had ever been put at risk by his whistleblowing. And yet the headlines the next day said precisely the opposite. Shaler sells agent lives down the river for money, or some such rubbish. And I was thinking, hang on, I was in the same courtroom as the journalists who wrote the stories. What were they taking down in their shorthand? And that got me thinking about how the spies and how the government and how the intelligence community can manipulate what was the media then, and what is now, I consider, the old, dead, dying media. The newspapers, the mainstream television, the mainstream radio, which is static and inert. And certainly in the UK, and the UK is a past master of control and spying and secrecy, and I think the US is learning very quickly and unfortunately, very quickly catching up on what the UK has been doing for 100 years. The UK is a past master at controlling things like the media. They use a combination of soft and hard power. The soft power... Past master, yeah. The UK is a past master of control of the media. They use a combination of soft and hard power. The soft being the charm offensive against the journalists. Come and join us. Come and receive stories from us. Repeat what we want to say in the media. Support our position. Come into the secret circle. And it's terribly seductive. I know, I was recruited. I know how seductive it is. And then you get the next level where they are then asked, well, you've been a useful outlet for our information. How about you help us a bit back? Become an agent of influence within your newsroom. Tip us off if there is a story that is potentially embarrassing, or help to massage a story that might be harmful to us coming out of your news agency. And then you get the higher level meshings between the editors and the proprietors of the media and the top spies and the top politicians. And we've seen this not only with the lies around the war, the justification for the war in Iraq, but also on a more sordid level in the UK, with the phone hacking scandal between Rupert Murdoch's media and the celebrities. The media was sort of going into the phones and getting the messages for the celebrities, and getting tip-offs as well from the police. So every which way, there is meshing at different levels between the journalists and the spies and the editors and the proprietors and the top spies and the top politicians. It is an establishment which closes ranks against dissenters, and it closes ranks against whistleblowers, and it will cover up and protect those on the inside. So that's the soft power, but the hard power is where the law comes into play. The stick is used against journalists who do want to report and do want to expose and do want to do what is basically their job, what they are paid to do as journalists, which is hold power to account, speak truth to power. And if the UK journalists do this, they can be prosecuted, they can be threatened under a whole battery of different UK laws. Not just what we saw going on with The Guardian, where the powers of the state go in and smash up a couple of hard disks. They can be prosecuted under terrorism legislation. They can be prosecuted under the Official Secrets Act itself, just like the whistleblowers, for breach of Section 5, although they do have one defence, which is if they do not cause damage to national security, they will not be prosecuted. They can be threatened with injunctions, with governmental injunctions. They can be threatened and self-censor under something called the Defence Press Advisory Committee in the UK, which is a self-censoring mechanism where top media types and top spies sit around a table, look at a story and decide, okay, we won't publish this bit because it might harm national security. And this is precisely why I think in the UK we've seen far less discussion of the Snowden disclosures across the wider old media, because there is indeed a D-notice in place because it's supposedly damaging to British national security. So there's a whole range of laws they can use to threaten journalists with, as well as just cutting them out of the secret charm circle. So it's very easy to manipulate public perception through the old media. Now, of course, the good side is we have the internet, and we even indeed still have pockets of free internet, I gather, thanks to all the geeks and the hacktivists. So if we can mobilise that, we can use that to build a meaningful fifth estate to counter this old inert media that is effectively part of the establishment, does the bidding of the spies. Then at least we can still get information out there. We can still have the freedom to ingest information and communicate information freely and in a democratic manner that will challenge the status quo. So I think in terms of pushback against this panopticon, that is one way we can do it. The other, of course, is through the law. It's been great that the European Parliament has been taking evidence from so many whistleblowers and so many experts about how they can protect European citizens from illegal snooping by this global surveillance state, which has, of course, come from the US intelligence agencies. And it's frightening hearing what's going on in the US and what's going on to your constitutional rights and to US citizens. But as you said earlier, Bill, that provides no protection whatsoever anyway to the rest of us. We are all foreigners here. We have no protection under whatever laws are now put in place to protect the US citizens within US borders, even if those meaningfully work, because they can always ask the Brits to do the dirty work for them. So we have a situation now where unless we take that power legally back into our control across Europe, and we can, hopefully, and perhaps build up the European knowledge base and infrastructure to avoid this over-reliance on the US infrastructure and networks and cloud systems and all the other rubbish that's backdoored to the nth degree, then we have a chance to get some sort of autonomy back. But the final way we can push back, the final way, is of course to encourage whistleblowers to come out. They are the regulators of last resort. When every other aspect of democratic accountability and oversight and control of the shadowy, secret state operating behind our governments, the intelligence infrastructure, when all of that accountability has been proven to have failed time and time and time and time again over decades, not just since 9/11, then the only thing we can rely on to get to the truth is the whistleblower. And also those who support and help those whistleblowers to get that information out, which of course is not the old mainstream media. Generally these days, they are too corrupted and too controlled and too complicit. So that's why initiatives like WikiLeaks have been so starkly beautiful to someone who has been involved in blowing the whistle. As soon as I heard about it, I just thought, fabulous, a direct conduit, a high-tech conduit between the whistleblower and the people who need to see that information, with no chance of blockages and with no chance of the government getting their hands on the documentary proof of what the whistleblower is saying. That is what the idea of WikiLeaks provides, and all power to them and all power to future models of that sort of organisation. But the other thing we need to be aware of, and just to finish, is the idea of what happens to the poor bloody whistleblower at the end of the process too. Because it's great for the journalists, you know, they get all the plaudits, they get all the awards, they make their careers. They make their careers. The whistleblower, whose information actually makes those careers, always ends up, at the very least, breaking their own careers. They will lose, at the very least, their professional life, their professional status, their means to make a good living. And what are they left with? Usually a ruined reputation. If they're unlucky, they will be in prison, they will have a criminal record. If they're really unlucky, they will end up facing the death penalty, as Chelsea Manning almost did, and Edward Snowden might still do. So one way we can encourage future whistleblowers is to show that they can survive the process. Not just survive, but thrive and build a new life and be seen to have the support globally from the grateful citizens of the world and what they've done, their sacrifice they've made, and what they've risked by showing the world what is going badly wrong behind the scenes. Which is why many of us are now getting together to launch a new organisation, which Diane mentioned right at the start. It's called Courage. And this is the new name that has evolved from an organisation, and I always have trouble saying this, Journalistic Source Protection Defence Fund. So if you see those letters floating around, it's now much more simply called Courage, the fund to protect journalistic sources. And we will be there to raise money so they can fight their legal battles, to advocate for the ideas behind whistleblowing and why what they whistleblow is so important. Because quite often they're not in a position themselves to be free to say and contextualise, this is important because of this is important because of that, socially, for all of us. So please keep an eye out for the launch of Courage over the next couple of months, and please spread the word, donate if you can, because it'll all go to a very good cause to protect not just existing at-risk whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden, but also to encourage and entice out future whistleblowers as our last regulators, as our regulators of last resort, the last defences for our democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Annie. That was a fabulous panel. I have actually two cypherpunks that sent me 2 questions in. I don't know, maybe I'll ask one. One's from Julian Assange, and I will just throw it here at the panel. And you can all decide if you want to answer or not answer, because I would like to, at least get 1 or 2 questions from the audience. How many questions might we have so we can gauge one? 1. Okay. 2. Grand. Okay, here we go. What direction would you like to see in the reporting surrounding the NSA disclosures take?
I guess I'll take that one. Well, I mean...
Thank you, Julian, by the way, if you're watching.
Yeah.
Wish you could be here. Sorry.
Actually, we sent, in response to the, before the president made his announcement of what he was thinking about for changing NSA, we sent him 21 recommendations. We also shared it with everyone in the EU, all your EU members, as well as Congress. Because, if you know your government, they'll try to suppress this kind of knowledge. So one of the things we had, and one of the main issues that we had of the 21, was to give both Congress and the courts and the public a way of verifying what NSA, CIA, FBI are saying is true, because they have a consistent, pattern of lying. I mean, when was the last time you remember them telling the truth? Okay, so we suggested that they put together a set of technical people, and we recommended hackers, because they would do the job properly. But we recommended we put together a group of technical people who would have the clearances and the authority to go into all these agencies, sit on their machines, look into their databases, look and see what processes they have running, and actually do interrogations into those databases, to verify what they're telling Congress. Like, for example, when Senator Udall asked NSA, how many U.S. citizens do you have in your databases? And they went hemmed and hawed, and I think took a couple of weeks to answer. And when they answered, they said, we can't tell you that because it would be a violation of the privacy rights of the U.S. citizens. This is a written answer from NSA. It shows you the arrogance of these people. So what we were proposing was to have a technical team that would go in there and just bypass all their BS, right, and all their barriers, and go into the raw data and figure that out. I mean, a simple program could do that. And we had recommended hackers to do that. But we had 20 other recommendations too. And then we added a 22nd, which was to, and this was an important one. I don't know why we didn't think, we were more technical, so we didn't think of the right from all the civil rights, but it's the idea that if you're put on a list for a watch list or no travel list or no fly list or a kill list, okay?
Oh, we have those too.
The point is that you have the right to challenge the basis for your being put on that list. So that any individual, if they have a sense that they're on a list, has the right to first find out that they're on that list, and also to have the due process to address why they put them on the list, and have a procedure and a way to get off the list. None of that exists today.
Thank you. That's good to know, actually. Okay.
Can I answer that question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
I would like to see more primary source documents from this particular disclosure. I think that for me, I recognize that there are legal threats with that regard for people, for the journalists, for the source, but fundamentally, for me, I do not trust the Congress's oversight of this matter. And once again, the issue of the Privacy Act violation, I've heard journalists also say that we can't release this information because of the Privacy Act violations that would occur if names of agents or the targets of the people that were targeted by the NSA. I mean, fundamentally, I really feel that what primary source documents do is they empower ordinary people like myself. I mean, I'm a perfect example. I mean, I started following the 210 disclosures. I worked in IT at the time, and I had extramurally blogged. And as I continued to follow the story, so it empowers people to take action because they are invested in it. It's their documents.
Excellent, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, I'm sorry, Andy Miller-Magoon, I don't know if we'll have time for your question because I would really like to answer the audience questions. Hello, Elsa.
Hello, my name is Elsa Rosbach, and I'm a U.S. citizen who lived here in the 60s and have been for a while. And my question is primarily to Mr. Binney, that you mentioned that the real implication was creating a police state. And thinking about the church hearings and what that revealed about QuantalPro, so surveillance in the 60s and 70s, and was not only that privacy was violated, but it was operational. The people's organizations were divided and dismantled. The Black Panther Party, some of the student anti-war organizations, we know there were blackmail attempts against Martin Luther King, probably many others that were never disclosed. We know this goes back, this same pattern, to the McCarthy era when the unions were broken to a large degree with the communists were the terrorists of the time, and going back even to the First World War, the first establishment of the FBI, that they said, a labor dissident is working for the Germans during World War I. So my question is, since they are able now to have even much more information than they did before, is this being used to dismantle people's organizations now, the unions, the anti-war organizations, actively?
Short answer is yes, and here's how. They have a special operations division set up within the law enforcement that includes CIA, NSA, FBI, DEA, DHS, and IRS. Okay, and what they're doing is this group is to interrogate NSA data. And for example, the IRS could use that to target things like the Tea Party, because all the metadata gives you your whole social network, and therefore it lays out the entire Tea Party. So they could use them to harass them and try to prevent them from being effective politically. By the way, COINTELPRO was only one of the programs. The other one was Chaos. CIA had a parallel one called Chaos that did fundamentally the same thing. And NSA had a program called Minaret that was after the same targets and people. So they had all those sources of information contributing to this effort. And it was J. Edgar Hoover, I think, consolidated it. So You know, all this is simply, I refer to this as a J. Edgar Hoover on steroids, because this is information and power against everybody. And by the way, I wanted to make it clear. The spying that's going on first started with U.S. citizens, and now everybody in the world, so you all are just being treated like U.S. citizens. We're all the same.
Thank you. Leif, please, thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Bill. First, I wanted to thank you for the personal sacrifices you made to expose wrongdoing. I wanted to... I wanted to ask you, though, about... my understanding is in 2001, when you left the NSA, it was primarily motivated by the Dragnet surveillance of American citizens. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that perspective, that is fundamentally more wrong than Dragnet surveillance of non-US persons, and if your perspective on that has evolved at all, and how it might have.
Okay, well, my perspective was that all that was wrong. All of it.
Oh, okay, really? I sort of have misunderstood that. Prior to that, was there not Dragnet surveillance of...
No, they didn't have the capability prior. They only had a limited capability to collect data. They didn't have the bulk capability until we invented it. Sorry.
Thanks.
But the point was that the objection for U.S. citizen bulk acquisition of information is based on our law. All right, my opposition to collecting everybody in the world was the fact that it made all our analysts dysfunctional and they couldn't do the job. That's a reason not to do it. We don't have a law that says we are not allowed to do that. That's the problem, okay? But those are the two reasons I used not to do any of it.
Okay, I think we have Christopher Gansing.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you so much for coming on stage here during our Festival for Art and Digital Culture, actually, and sharing these stories with us and showing how whatever else we have discussed in relation to these questions are related to very, very urgent issues that we're dealing with in the world right now. And the way that you do this, there's this cliche that the personal is the political. Yesterday we heard a rephrase of this, that the personal is the geopolitical. And the paradox of hearing your stories is that, of course, you're not doing this to draw attention to yourselves. It's also like what Edward Snowden said, but to get this information out in the public. But we need your stories in order to, we need your life stories in order to be able to grasp the extent of the issues we're dealing with. And that leads me to my question, and that's really about motivation. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about why people are not motivated within these organizations that you have worked in to do the same thing. Because
We have 2 minutes.
It's completely obvious why you have done it. So please tell a little bit more the fear and the coercion that makes people not to act.
I guess that's yours.
Well, at NSA, most of the population, about 85% of it, are ISTJs on the Myers-Briggs, personal character property. Introverted, sensing, technical, and judgmental. These are the perfect people to do a job that focuses on a desk issue right in front of you. You isolate yourself, and they're introverts, so they don't interact with people very well, but they're also the very, very same kind of people who are easily threatened. So these are the kind of people you can brutalize and threaten. And that's exactly what they've done. And so they made them afraid to even do anything. This, by the way, has destroyed the incentive to be creative and innovative internally. And that's what happens in the general society, too, with a surveillance state. It destroys innovation and creativity and destroys the advancement of civilization. That's what it does.
I'd say from the inside in MI5, because there's this blanket secrecy, there is no ventilation, there's nowhere you can go if you have concerns. So if you have ethical qualms, you're told to just shut up and not rock the boat and just follow orders, precisely that. And that doesn't mean people who go into this line of work want a job that will make a difference. They want to serve their country or save lives or stop attacks or whatever. They are motivated to do that. And when they see things going badly wrong, they're also motivated to try and change things from within. And then they're told to shut up. So, I mean, I remember during my time, most of my intake were flooding out of MI5 because they had exactly the same ethical qualms and concerns that I and my former partner had. Unfortunately, they had more ties as well. Quite often they'd have mortgages or marriages or children or whatever. So they didn't have the same degree of freedom to turn their whole lives inside out, to blow the whistle, to go on the run. Because if you want to do that, you know the risks you're taking. You know what you face and the fact you will never have the same life again. You will lose your professional status, possibly your liberty, your freedom, everything. So it is a huge risk to take. And if you have other responsibilities, it's very difficult to put your loved ones at risk in that way. But sometimes you just see things that are so bad, you've got to try and do something. And I think it's the motivation that takes you into that line of work that can then result in the whistleblowers. So this is partly why we want to encourage more to come out and say, look, we know how bad things are getting. Come out, you won't be alone. There's a whole network of us who can help you now.
And to create funds and for quick response and to take them in, and so they're not so isolated. Would you like to answer?
It's interesting, the idea of the personal is political. The personal is definitely political in a totalitarian state. You know, because the very act of human life, the most natural elemental acts of human life become under the purview of the government. That's not a good scenario. I kind of like the anti-political, the anti-politician sort of stance from the former Czechoslovakia. You know, when the state itself is so counter to the natural aims of life, something is wrong with the state, and I think that's the scenario that we have here. In terms of personal motivation, I think that for me, I don't really understand it, and I don't really analyze myself too much. I have a very intense sort of passion for life. If I turn that on myself, it's like basically like turning the NS, like I'm not doing that. The energy, I like to focus outward. I believe that service is fundamentally the pillar of a good life. My problems seem very small when I focus on other people and contributing to the larger world. And also, I think that I am lucky because, like you said, I think that unlike I don't have children and I'm free to do whatever the hell I want whenever I want. And that gives me the freedom to have, sometimes, I'm not saying that women who have children don't have the freedom of thought, but I'm saying that I don't have contingencies to concern myself with, like a mouth to feed, so I better keep my mouth shut so I keep this job. I can do as I please.
Thank you for that. I like this comment. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Arjen's last name, how do I pronounce it? Kamphaus. I think I'm going to close this panel here and saying, I think it's time that we need citizen engagement. It's time to get involved. We are in a state of emergency, and this is not an aesthetic problem. We have a political problem. We need agency. We need tools for encryption. We need all kinds of things. We need legal assistance. We need a whole battalion of people to get involved and to overturn this turnkey tyranny that's upon us. And to close this on based on journalism, because it's also where we cannot make informed decisions if we don't have information. Thank you, Chelsea. If you want to do serious journalism, it amounts to information guerrilla warfare against your own government. That's Arjen Kamphaus. Thank you very much for being here today. It's my great honor to have been on this panel and for this great program and for the Transmediale, and we hope that you've enjoyed it too. Thanks very much.